Welcome to Notes 1.9 for U.S. History class. These cover imperialism in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So the first thing you're probably wondering is, well, what's imperialism? Well, imperialism is when a country increases their influence and their power in other countries in other parts of the world. So they really start to have more influence. So when the U.S. was colonized by Britain, that was imperialism. When the U.S. gets involved in other countries, that can be considered imperialism. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the U.S. got involved outside of the U.S. in several different ways, and all of those are examples of imperialist actions. So why do countries become imperialistic? Well, there are four main reasons. The first, militarism, is the buildup or the growth of their armies. So as their armies and navies get bigger, they need ports for them to stay in and places for them to stop and get supplies. And you want to have that military influence around the world. So bases and things like that, that gets you involved in other countries. The second ties into militarism, and it's called nationalism. And nationalism is that pride in your country and that belief that your country is the best. So if other countries are doing the same thing, you should be doing it too, and you want to be the best and stay ahead of the other countries. Your third reason is economics. And so in order to have new markets for your goods, to find new natural resources for your goods, so that businesses can thrive, they need access to the rest of the world. And so imperialism gives them that ability to go out into the rest of the world and have that influence or gain those goods. And when you gain those goods, your country as a whole benefits from that. So that is very important. The fourth reason is humanitarian. We see these countries that need aid, that need help. Especially around 1900, it was we need to spread Western ideas, Christianity, and democracy. We need to help those that are less fortunate. This even ties into the idea of social Darwinism, that we as Americans are more fortunate and more evolved and more advanced, so we need to go out and help those that are less evolved and less advanced than we are. So that idea even ties back to some of those earlier ideas we covered in the unit. So the U.S. became imperialistic, number one, for economic reasons. We had these huge factories and these huge businesses, and we needed all these resources. And remember, now we got Teddy Roosevelt saying you can't destroy our natural land, so let's go destroy someone else's. So the businesses actually went out and got their resources from those places. They also had run out of markets here in the U.S. They were selling things, and all the consumers in the U.S. had what they were selling. So if everybody has a car, people don't always need two or three. You need to find someone new to buy your car for you. And so that's what they did. They went out and found other places where they could sell their goods, and those were their markets. So that's our economic involvement. Our second reason for American involvement in other countries is security, or that whole military idea. We needed bases and we needed places for our military to be in other countries, and so we built those. We built this great big new Navy now that we had money and we were past, we hadn't updated since the Civil War. So we needed places for it to be, which means we needed islands in the Pacific for bases so our ships could stop there and refuel, and we could protect our business interests overseas as well. And our third reason for American imperialism was preserving the American spirit. Many people thought America was losing its vitality, losing its edge, what was special about it. So this is going to tie into nationalism, because we really felt like if we expand, we will discover new things, and we will be exploring. We always explored the Wild West, explorers coming to America, and so we'll continue doing that, and that will help America step it up and keep its vitality. And that also means that we can help others who are less fortunate than us. So it ties into humanitarian as well, that helping those less fortunate and that social Darwinism idea again. So these are the three major reasons that America gets involved in other countries. And the one that public opinion supports the most is economics. We support that making money, having those markets. We support business growth. So American public opinion supports that, but what our government and our country find out is you can't have economic involvement in another country and not have military and humanitarian involvement. So if you have a business there, you have to protect the business. You have to protect your individuals there. You have to make sure the workers that your businesses are hiring are being treated fairly. So all of that comes down to those other factors as well. You can't just have economic. So there are many, many examples of American imperialism, but just some of them are the Spanish-American War, the annexation and addition of Hawaii to the United States as a territory, our involvement in Samoa in the Pacific, the open door policy we have with China for trade, the building of the Panama Canal, and the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And I'll talk a little bit about all of these, but the ones that I'm going to talk in the most depth about here in the notes are the Spanish-American War and the Panama Canal. So those are the two that you really should know the most about. And this particular cartoon, if you look at the one that is on the screen right now, really does show kind of America growing and becoming more imperialistic and more involved in the world. So you see us from a baby, and we get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then we get fairly fat. And so as different things happen, we grow. And that's our influence that's growing. And so I really like that cartoon and think it shows kind of how we become more and more involved in the rest of the world. And you see those hands waiting for a handout at the end that shows our involvement in other countries' reliance on the United States. So the first big event that really gives the U.S. world power and gives us this look is the Spanish-American War. And this slide does have a lot of information on it, so this might be a time where you'd want to pause and write some things down. But we will talk through the causes, some of the events of the war, and the results of the war here in the next few slides. So the first cause we're going to look at is called yellow journalism. Yellow journalism was during the time period similar to muckraking but different, because the purpose of yellow journalism was not to create change and get awareness. The purpose of yellow journalism was to sell newspapers. And so we had two major publishers, Hertz and Pulitzer, who were trying to sell the most newspapers. And so they literally would exaggerate things and try to have the best story, the most interesting story, so people would buy their paper and not the other one. And so they would tell all kinds of stories about the mistreatment of the Cubans by the Spanish, because at this time Cuba was under Spanish control, and how the U.S. was ignoring it and allowing torture to happen, and these poor people were being treated this way. And why wouldn't the U.S. do anything? So they were already garnering some public support and some emotion behind the war before anything else happened. So thanks to yellow journalism, we have public support behind the war. And then a letter comes out from the Spanish ambassador in Washington, D.C. that is totally insulting our president, President McKinley. And it bashes him as being ineffective, and he can't do anything, and Spain doesn't have to worry about the U.S. because of him. And so this also gets published by the newspapers. And this even adds more public support against Spain and towards both our country and towards Cuba. Then we have the explosion of the Maine, and this huge event is kind of our end piece that's going to set it off. The USS Maine had been sent to Cuba and was sitting in the harbor. It's a military ship. It was there to protect American business interests in Cuba. So tensions are already very high, but it's there to protect businesses and Americans that are in Cuba for business at the time, because things are very unsettled within Cuba. And the Maine explodes in February of 1898 while it's sitting in the harbor. And of course the journalists are all over it, and if you look at the title there, caused by a bomb or torpedo, Spain blew up the Maine. Well, in reality, that's not actually what happened. A boiler on the ship exploded, and that caused the explosion, killing people on board. But at the time, they didn't know that. Yellow journalism comes out with this, Spain bombed us. Well, what do? We react, we fight back. And so that's exactly what we do. In November, we declare war on Spain in Cuba and start the Spanish-American War. So some big events in the war included Teddy Roosevelt, who was Secretary of the Navy at the time, resigned from his post so that he could go fight in the war and lead this group of called the Rough Riders, who were cavalry. They rode horses and fought, and very great publicity in those newspapers again. So Teddy Roosevelt did that. He even was known to call the war a splendid little war. The war literally lasted 3 months. It was a very, very short war. The U.S. was right there. We were ready for this. We had been building up. Like, we wanted to show off our strength. Spain's clear across the ocean. And then the U.S., because we had ports and bases in other parts of the world, we actually also allied with the Philippines and the rebels there who wanted to overthrow their Spanish leaders. So the Spain also controlled there. So we helped them in the Pacific. So Spain had to fight in the Pacific and in Cuba, sending troops all the way from Spain to do this. And there was no way for them to really be able to financially do this, and just with their personnel. So it was really easy for America to win, or at least the side we sided on to win. So we did that. The war ends, like I said, within 3 months. So for such a tiny, short war, this has some really important results. Number one, the U.S. is recognized as a world power. We had never fought a war off our soil. Both the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 were on our own soil. We had a navy. We had gone off and we had defeated Spain, who had one of the best navies in the world. So we really did become a world power with this war. And we're recognized as one of the top powers in the world after this. The second thing that happened is that the U.S. gained some territories from this war because Spain had controlled them, we beat them, we got the territories. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines were all given to the U.S. to deal with. Now some of these, there are rules about, like Cuba gains independence eventually, but the Philippines become the one that really are going to matter and are going to take a longer amount of time from the U.S. So what happens with the Philippines, you ask? Well, the Philippines, it becomes really important because they're in the Pacific and the U.S. wants to be able to use those islands. So we want the resources, we want the markets, and we want the military bases. So the rebels thought they were going to get independence. The U.S. decides, based on humanitarian social Darwinism ideas, that the Filipino rebels are not ready for independence. So we decide they will be a territory of the U.S. They don't want that. So it actually ensues with a 3-year Filipino War, the American-Filipino War, and it is a brutal, bloody war. We fight terribly brutally in it. On both sides, but really the Americans, because of our technology, it's much more brutal. And we end up with over 4,000 Americans killed and over 16,000 Filipinos killed in the war. And eventually the war does end, like I said, 3 years later, but it continues to be a struggle between America and the Philippines until we finally give the Philippines their independence following World War II. In 1946. So they don't actually gain full independence for 50 years almost. And this increases America's sphere of influence into the Pacific and gives us a steady footing there. Now Cuba, we promised at the end of the war to follow this Teller Amendment, which means that Cuba gains independence eventually. We can't add Cuba to the U.S. as another state or a territory. So we promise not to do that, but what we don't want is anarchy and problems in Cuba. So we actually keep a military government there, we help them set up new schools, a new economy, and we help them write their constitution. So once we feel that Cuba is ready for self-rule, then the U.S. government steps out. Our businesses stay there, however. Now in Puerto Rico, as you guys know, they don't gain independence. Puerto Rico is still today a territory of the United States. And we made them a territory, they remained a territory, and it wasn't until 1917 there were some issues of rebellion, some questions in there, right as World War I was happening and starting, and we actually gave all Puerto Ricans American citizenship in 1917, and so since then Puerto Rico has been very happily a territory of the U.S. So some other Pacific actions, other actions in the Pacific or the Eastern Hemisphere. Remember I said you don't need to know as much about these. Hawaii. It's actually, there is a revolt over, by American businesses, the pineapple planters, led by Dole even, because you know Dole pineapple, to overthrow Queen Alukalani in Hawaii. And so when they do that, these American businesses then ask the U.S. as the new leadership of Hawaii if the U.S. will add Hawaii to the U.S. And the U.S. adds Hawaii as a territory. Now they're in the Pacific, they're a great stepping stone to the rest of the Pacific, so it definitely benefits the U.S. militarily, it benefits us economically with the businesses there, and it's kind of a buffer militarily. So we add it and they become a territory. They don't become a state until the 1950s, so don't think that it becomes a state now. It's just a territory with our businesses there. So Samoa is the next, and Samoa is a place, it's another stepping stone, another island in the Pacific that helps us with our trade with Asia. So what we end up doing is we negotiate with Britain and Germany, and we gain access to the harbor there. So there's no fighting, there's no issues, no overthrows. We negotiate with other imperialistic countries for the harbor so we don't have to fight over it. And then finally China, and China's a little bit different. So if you look at this cartoon, you see that these European powers are carving up China. So basically what they were doing is they went into China and this huge market, because China's so big with so many people, and they started to just say, well, this piece is mine and this piece is mine, whether China wanted it or not. And so the US, here we see them, stepped in, and we didn't want to lose access to things, and Europe had already been doing this before we got in there. So what the US did is we came up with this idea of an open door policy to China, which meant that all countries could trade freely with all of China. And so this benefits China because they're not getting carved up. It benefits the US because we gain access to the entire country, even though we didn't before, and we may not have if the European powers had not wanted to give us access. So our open door policy with China is accepted, and we get to trade with all of China freely. So that's the Eastern Hemisphere, Asia and the Pacific. So what was happening in the Western Hemisphere? How did the U.S. gain control and influence in the Western Hemisphere? Well, in this case, the big thing here is going to be the Panama Canal. So France had bought the rights to the Panama Canal area, the Panama Canal zone, from Colombia, and had been building this canal for years, or attempting to build it. So Colombia controlled the area that's today Panama, as well as Colombia. So they'd been trying to build the canal, but they had run into a lot of yellow fever and disease, which was killing off their workers. They had run into financial problems, all kinds of issues. And so France was realizing they could not build the canal. So they had leased the land with the promise that they would build the canal, and if they didn't get the canal built, all of the land as well as the money reverted back to Colombia. So what France did is they sold the rights to the US for $40 million in 1902. And so this is Teddy Roosevelt's our president, and so we make this deal that we will now have the canal and control it. So the Colombians did not want the US to build the canal, because if France doesn't meet their deal, the Colombians can resell the rights to the canal for even more money. So the U.S. meets this resistance that Colombia doesn't want them involved. So the U.S. figures out how to get around this, because Teddy Roosevelt was also very forceful and very powerful in his foreign policy as well as his domestic policy. So what we end up doing, the Panamanians don't want to be under Colombian control. So basically we encourage their rebellion, and immediately as soon as they rebel, we recognize Panama as a country. We say, yep, this is Panama, the US recognizes it. Then Panama allows us to build the canal on their land because they're no longer Colombian. So by 1914, the canal is completed, and its credit is all given to Teddy Roosevelt for the U.S. because he's the one who managed to get the U.S. the ability to build the canal. Roosevelt is also responsible for the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine, which was done over 100 years before this, said that the U.S. will oppose any efforts by any outside power to control any nation in the Western Hemisphere. So it keeps new imperialism from happening in the Americas, both North and South. They weren't going to deal with any that were already here, but they would get involved with outside powers. The Roosevelt corollary adds that the U.S. will not use this so that we can add new lands to our country. So we'll do it to help other countries in the Americas, and North and South and Central America, in the Caribbean, but we won't actually try to make them American countries. So remember, this is after the Spanish-American War, but Roosevelt is president and he adds that piece in. And so the other thing about Teddy Roosevelt and his foreign policy you do need to know is his big stick policy. And Roosevelt's big stick policy is probably his most famous foreign policy piece, and it's not really an official, like, it wasn't ever written down anywhere, but you'll see all these cartoons with Roosevelt with a big stick, and you've seen a couple already, this one here. So the idea is that Teddy Roosevelt was very active in foreign policy, and he was willing to use force when necessary to get what he wanted, and what he thought was best. So you see him here using the stick, getting what he wants, bigger than everyone else. And he used this phrase, speak softly and carry a big stick. And that's really what he based his foreign policy off of. I'll ask for what I want and I'll try to get it in a peaceful manner, and if I don't, I'll use force. And that's how America's foreign policy worked, and if you look back through the pieces we talked about today, you can see how those examples fit into the speak softly and carry a big stick idea of Teddy Roosevelt.